Leonard Laban was born in the 1530s to a rather wealthy family in the south of England. But his father died soon after he was born, and his mother decided to transfer all of the love she had felt for her husband onto her son. And she was determined that he would never come to any harm whatsoever. To this end, she banished from the house anything sharp. All the knitting needles, the scissors, the knives, they all had to go. So the cooks had to use large wooden spoons to squash the vegetables in the kitchen. She locked the doors leading to the upstairs floors so that her son might never fall down the stairs. And she cut off all the legs from the beds so that Leonard might never fall out of bed. All the music in depressing minor keys was thrown out, and nets were placed around the garden in the summertime to make sure no stinging insects would come in to get her son. And the gardeners had to remove all of the thorns from the rose bushes. She fired all the female servants so that Leonard might never have to know the pains of love. And she also fired anybody over the age of 30 so that he might never see the ravages of old age and sickness. For herself, she dyed her hair with henna and wore a veil to cover her wrinkles. Thus it was that Leonard grew up in a house full of sunshine and song, rosewater and honey. And when thunderstorms would roll in, well, they'd keep him indoors that day to play games with the servants, who were under strict instructions to always let him win. And if the thunder roared a bit too loudly, well, they'd mix a bit of opium in with his milk to make him sleepy and reassured. Leonard's inevitable awakening occurred at the age of 12. He woke up early one morning to a scratching noise at the window of his room. And going over, he saw there was a bird on the outside window ledge, scraping its wing against the window and moving in a strange way. He tried to open the window, but of course it was locked. And instead, he decided to do something quite original. He walked towards the door, where his servant lay snoring across the doorway for Leonard's protection. And carefully, oh so carefully, he reached in and picked out the key to the lock, opened the door, and pulling it just far enough not to wake the servant, but enough he could squeeze through, he stepped out into the hallway of his house. The house was still silent at its early morning hour, and lifting up the great big bolt that closed the main door, he stepped out into the garden and found himself alone there for the first time in his life. Then he remembered the bird. Running over, the bird took fright and fluttered up onto the high garden wall with some difficulty. And the wall was tall and smooth with no handholds, but his mother had underestimated just how fast Leonard had grown recently. And by placing a few flower pots all together and making a running jump, he was able to scramble up on top of the garden wall. And what he saw there almost made him fall off. As he looked out on the outside world for the very first time, he saw that peasants were hard at work in the fields, bending over, their joints cracking painfully. They had grey, thinning hair, scars upon their faces, as they worked with primitive tools, toiling the soil for the benefit of the rich. Then he saw a donkey and cart coming along. The donkey was so thin its ribs pressed against its skin, and its fur was mangy, diseased. And the driver cracked the whip across the donkey's shoulder to make it go faster, and Leonard felt it almost as though it was on his shoulders. Then his attention returned to the bird on the wall, which no longer had the strength to resist as he scooped it up in his hands. And he felt it terrified, and yet his heart was slowing down as all life began to ebb away. Leonard just couldn't bear it. It was as though he and this bird shared the same life, they breathed the same air, their hearts pulsed with the same blood. And something rather miraculous happened. There was a deep explosion inside Leonard's heart, and a wave of compassion flowed through his chest and his shoulders, through his arms and his hands, and into the body of the bird. It perked up at once, gave a and flew up onto Leonard's shoulder. Leonard took one last regretful look back at the prison of his childhood, and leapt down on the other side of the wall and walked off, never to return again. He walked with no particular direction, but wherever he went, he extended his hands, and the gift of life flowed into people, animals, even trees and plants. He took the years off the old, he returned the strength to the elderly, he returned beauty to old women to whom no one had looked at with desire in many years. He cured diseases. He gave people a chance to live again. He slept wherever he found himself, but each morning he woke up there was always a queue of the old and the ill, begging for his healing, as news of the gift of life, the boy with the gift of life in his hands, spread through the lands. I suppose eventually news of this miraculous healer would have reached the ears of some rich merchant or baron or king, and Leonard would have been invited, quite forcibly, at the sword, to come along as special guest and kept there forever. But before that could happen, tragedy struck. Leonard was healing an old lady one day, growing teeth back into empty gums and removing the wrinkles from her face, when his little bird, who had been his constant companion since the very beginning, was fluttering nearby, when a bird of prey, an eagle, swooped down upon it, and in a mess of feathers and blood, the little bird fell down to the ground. Leonard would have run over to help his friend at once, but the old lady insisted, no, please return the life to her and make her young again, because she did so much want to see what her grandchildren would grow up to be. Leonard hurriedly healed and rejuvenated her, and then ran over to his little bird and scooped it up in his hands. But its body was cold and lifeless as clay. But for the first time, the gift of life refused to flow, and Leonard learnt that whilst he had the power to heal, rejuvenate, he had no dominion over death. And he cursed himself for the fool he had become. Who did he think he was, anyway? The tides of death swept over the lands every day, not discriminating for rank or position. What chance did one man have to hold back the sea, after all? He left the country and went to travel abroad. He gave up on healing and just became a gardener for the rich, who wondered at this, a man's skill for tending their plants and trees and making them bloom and flower and blossom even in the middle of winter. Leonard allowed himself to grow old, and he learned what ravages time can wreak upon the body. He felt the pain in his joints when he bent over to tend the earth. He felt his eyesight and hearing begin to fail. His mind began to work slowly and play tricks upon him, and he was quite sure that his employers joked about his senility when he wasn't looking. And as the autumn leaves fell in Leonard's 60th year, he was quite sure it would be his last winter. But then he saw her. She was just a peasant girl, but there was something in the way she walked across the earth, a lightness like the breeze. Her skin shone with the early morning sunshine, and when she sang, it was like water bursting out of the earth. maybe just one more time? The next morning, the young girl's parents were delighted, rather shocked to be honest, at the arrival of this young man, a doctor, so he said, who had come to ask for their daughter's hand in marriage. As for her, this was a match well beyond her wildest dreams. And he was handsome and charming and came from abroad, but that didn't matter. He was a doctor after all. They were soon married in a simple ceremony. And Leonard set up a medical practice nearby, with astonishing results, and his fame as a doctor soon spread throughout the land. They saved up some money and bought one of the big houses nearby with the fabulous gardens which, until recently, had been tended by an old and talented gardener who had mysteriously disappeared. They had 2 sons, and thanks to their father's skill as a healer, they were able to survive all of the usual childhood diseases. But as gifted as Leonard was, he had no power over the tides of fate and politics that can always sweep the country. And when the king's army came to town looking for eligible young men, they took away Leonard's sons to go and fight in one of the endless wars being fought abroad. When 3 years had passed without word from his sons, he and his wife began to give up hope they would ever see them again. Wearing black, falling into mourning, they began to lose hope and even desire to go on living. They grew older. And only when 10 more years passed, each of them had grey hairs and thick wrinkles upon their faces, Leonard decided things had gone far enough. He invited his wife into the drawing room one morning and made a stand in front of the mirror. They could see their age reflected back at them. And he told her, "Listen, all that was can be again." And passing his hands over her face, he restored that luscious black colour to her hair. He restored that soft, glowing amber look to her skin, and she stood straight for the first time in years. She turned around, trembling, looking at her husband, and finally said, "You're a demon!" And she ran through towards the kitchen. Leonard stood there, wondering perhaps he should have told her years ago. Oh, he had to make her see that this was a miracle, it was a blessing, it was a chance to try again. He went through to the kitchen, but he found his wife lying on the ground with the kitchen knife buried in her chest. He bent over and extended his hands to heal her. But it was too late. She'd already become as cold as the kitchen floor. Leonard never loved again after that. Women loved him, of course, and you could see it in their eyes. This man who seemed to belong in another world, so little did he live in this one. And every now and then he'd allow himself to grow older with them, for 10, even 15 years before he'd just walk out of the house in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. He'd reappear somewhere else, 10 or 20 years younger. He said that as he watched each generation rise up and fall away, he felt like he was a tree, watching the flowers blossom, bud, and fail away. But he no longer had any desire to join them. Because as the world began to spin faster and faster, Leonard stayed alive due to a burning curiosity. As time passed, the times seemed to be changing faster than ever. He soon learned that the Earth was not at the centre of the universe after all, and in fact it went around the sun. Oh, and forget about it being flat. He learned that kings and queens, well, just as he suspected, they were as human as anyone else. As he learned more and he saw society changing and new technological inventions coming along and changing the face of the world, all he lacked was someone to talk to about it. It was in 1721 that I first met Leonard. I was a student in his philosophy and religion class. I was quite under the spell of this respected old professor who seemed to have an answer for everything. And so I asked him one day. One remaining doubt I had as a good Christian was that in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, Adam and Eve are there in the Garden of Eden and they choose to eat an apple from the tree of knowledge. But what about the other tree, the tree of eternal life? Why hadn't they eaten from that tree first? Because, well, then they could have grown to be old enough to learn anything they wanted to know. But who, after all, would want to live forever? Leonard asked us. Well, I would for one, I cried. Oh, how we laughed. How often I've regretted saying those foolish words. It was in the twilight of my life, my early 60s. I was living in London and my servant came to me late one night telling me there was a visitor at the door who insisted upon seeing me despite the ungodly hour. I grabbed a lantern and went along to see who it was and saw a young man there with a striking resemblance to an old professor of mine. Before I could say anything, he reached out his hands and removed the decades from me in moments. I stood, once again, young and tall. In a state of shock, I allowed myself to be guided through to my own kitchen. Now, I was no longer a Christian, of course. The age of reason had quite taken away my faith, but for a moment I did wonder if I had made some kind of pact with the devil. But Leonard soon explained to me that this was a gift, a miracle of sorts, but not one that required any kind of God. Can you imagine? To be given the chance to live over again, young and strong, but with a lifetime of experience and learning behind you. The things I saw, the things I learned. Sweeping social revolutions, technological changes. Well, I found out that women, they were apparently just as smart as men. And people of other colours, they were just as human as we were, apparently. The earth was not thousands of years old, but millions, or even more. And the technology, I mean, can you imagine? To see for the very first time a photograph, a train, a plane, electricity. And yet, as time passed, as Leonard came by to see me every 10 years or so and restore me to my youth, and we talked about the changing times, yet a doubt began to grow. I began to wonder if progress was nothing more than a smokescreen. It seemed to me that for all these wonderful changes, it was still self-interest that made the world go round. Or perhaps I just began to see the world through the lens of my own personal sadness. To love so many times and to lose. My 17 wives, 31 children. I watched them all grow up and die away of disease, of old age. How many times can the human heart love before it breaks into so many pieces you can never put it back together again? I began to dread Leonard's visits, and finally I began to hide. But wherever I went, Leonard always seemed to find me. I went off to wars in the hopes of catching a bullet or a stray piece of shrapnel, but the one time that I was badly injured, who would turn out to be my doctor there in the medical tent? I managed to hide once for some 30 years, taking up residence in a cave in the Himalayas. sitting there every day like a holy man, and that's what the villagers took me to be anyway. They brought me fruit to live on. And I sat there every day, gazing out into the emptiness, until my beard grew so long it reached the ground. But that very morning, who should come walking around the mountain path but Leonard with a bowl of fruit under his arm to offer me. You might ask me about suicide. I tried it a few times. But I found that when it came down to it, I could no more take my own life than I could eat a rock or breathe underwater. And so here I am, held captive, a hostage in time, condemned to live until Leonard finally lets me go.